Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining this session, using data to help you move ahead in your community. Your presenters have worked really hard at putting together this valuable information for you. And before we get started, I'd like to go ahead and tell you a little bit about each of our extremely knowledgeable presenters that you are lucky to listen to today. So we have Evan Curtis. Mr. Evan Curtis is a state planning coordinator with the Utah Governor's Office of Management and Budget. Curtis has been with the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, the GOMB, since 2007. And he has a unique background in both planning and budgeting. During this time with the GOMB, he has worked to provide outreach, research, and resources to local governments, served on numerous boards and commissions, and has been involved in numerous state planning efforts. Most recently, Curtis has worked with several state agencies to identify budget and policy solutions to natural resource issues. He serves as the governor's liaison with the U.S. Census Bureau and works with the Quality Growth Commission to administer the Leray McAllister Critical Lands Conservation Fund. He was appointed as state planning coordinator by Governor Herbert in 2015 and enjoys serving on the Envision Utah Executive Committee, the Utah Seismic Safety Commission, the Jordan River Commission, the Outdoor Recreation Advisory Committee, and the Executive Water Finance Board. Curtis earned a Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science, a Master of Science in Bioregional Planning, and a graduate certificate in the National Environmental Policy Act from Utah State University. In Evan's free time, he enjoys spending time with his family and recreating in Utah's magnificent outdoors. Next, we have Bert Granberg, data nerd lead at WFRC. Although his request for that on a business card still has not been approved, Bert might be an example of too much time spent with GIS in one life. And last but not least, we have Richard Brockmeyer. Richard Brockmeyer, AICP, joined UDOT Planning in the fall of 2018 as a planning manager. His area of focus is data development and analysis in support of planning efforts across the state, which includes continued development and support of the Utah statewide travel demand model. He is also playing a key role in the continued development of the Utah Transportation Commission's prioritization process, where he manages the development of several decision support tools for multimodal capacity project selection. Prior to his current role at UDOT, Richard worked at Fear and Peers, where he focused on travel demand modeling, big data analysis, transportation demand management, and multimodal planning. He also previously worked with the UTA Planning Department. Richard received his graduate degree from Arizona State University in urban and environmental planning, and also holds a bachelor's degree in history from Westminster College. Thank you so much, all of you, for being with us today. Please note we do have we will do a Q&A session at the end of each presenter. So please be sure to type your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and our presenters will be sure to answer them. This conference session is being recorded and presentations will also be made available. We'll begin this session with Mr. Richard Brockmeyer, followed by Bert Granberg, and lastly, Evan Curtis. Mr. Brockmeyer, take it away.
Okay, thanks. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Now is the moment of truth. If I can get everything working on my computer. So hopefully you all see my presentation now. Thumbs up?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about UDOT's capacity prioritization process and some of the data sets that we're using and some of the experiences that we've had. So just to set the stage a little bit, there's something called the TIF, which is the Transportation Investment Fund, and then the TTIF, which is the Transit Transportation Investment Fund. The TIF has been around since 2005. It's been the primary source of capacity projects for transportation projects across the state. And then there's some recent changes with SB 136, 72, and 34 that sort of opened up the eligibility for using, it created the TTIF to use funds state funds for transit projects, but also for funding active transportation projects and first last mile projects, or active transportation projects that have a direct connection to improving access to transit stations. And so that sort of created a need to really look at how we're prioritizing projects, a new way to look at how we're prioritizing not just the highway projects, but this whole new set of projects that we hadn't really done before in the department. And it also sort of focused in, and hopefully you can see this. Let me see if I can minimize that. The law also sort of required a direct connection to something called the strategic directive, or basically Utah's transportation vision. It asked the department to create sort of a direction for and a vision for the transportation system across the state. And that was created to sort of have everybody, all the MPOs, stakeholders, UDOT have sort of the same vision. And that focused around improving quality of life, increasing quality of life through sort of 4 outcome areas: good health, strong economy, better mobility, and connected communities. And what I'm showing here is sort of the framework that we took from that for data development and prioritization models. So we have each of those outcome areas, and then under each one of those, we have criteria that were developed with specific measures under each one of those. And that's the framework that we've set up for prioritizing all the projects that get nominated or that we start with in the state. This is the current highway model, and I'm showing this just to give you a little idea of the breadth of some of the data sources and data sets that we're using. So we've got some of the things that UDOT's been really good about understanding and looking at in the past, right? Under better mobility, that's really what the department's been focused on largely. And that's things like existing reliability, delay on roadways, existing traffic volumes, future traffic volumes. But we're now being asked to look at a much broader set of data sets. And things like, we've always looked at safety as well, but things like public health, how active or how transportation projects can improve public health, the impact to the environment, land use and community, economic development questions of future and current job locations and how we're serving those with projects, access to things like education and tourism. The active model looks at, again, a very similar framework. We're interested in those same outcome areas and those same criteria, but again, just sort of focused in on the amount of data and the types of data that we are now looking at and considering when we're making transportation investment decisions. So we're looking at not just vehicle crashes, but when we're talking about active transportation, we're looking at non-motorized crash trends. We're looking at level of traffic stress of the roadways that the projects would run against or run adjacent to or off of, and how much we're improving people's ability to have a low stress facility to use. How we're connecting to bike routes and transit stops. In the transit model, we have to think about ridership increases, some of the same things, how can we make the transportation decision to improve physical activity, for example. And then this last one is the first last mile model. Again, a lot of similar types of data sets, but again, this is really just to point out that we're now considering as a department much broader data sets and needs beyond just our sort of traditional delay and reliability and volumes, which is how prioritization decisions were largely made just for the highway side. Bert, I think, is going to do a much better job going into some of these data sources, but I'll just hit on some of, a lot of this data we're pulling from UDOT, and there's, I think Bert probably is going to speak to it as well, and I have a link at the end of my presentation. But there's a lot of data that UDOT serves out that you should all be aware of. Things like traffic volumes, traffic safety data, but we're adding more and more to that as an open data source. The data that we're using in this prioritization model, trying to make that more available. But then we're also having to tie into things like national data sets, the census LEHD, which provides sort of commute information, information about jobs and households in particular project areas. There's proprietary data that we use. We have vehicle probe data that we're used to using, but there's also active transportation data, which is more and more becoming more open source. And then we're having to tie into a lot of other agency data, so trying to find those resources and document where those are and make them accessible. So current and future socioeconomic data, that's something that we develop in the rural areas of the state. The MPOs develop for their travel demand models in their areas of the state, but we've all partnered to develop sort of a statewide data set that WFRC right now is gracious enough to host and provide out that can be a resource. Transit ridership data, UTA's done a lot of work to make more of their data available. Physical activity and other health data, this was a totally new one to me, but reaching out to the health department, they have lots of data that's available but not as easy to access. But knowing that those resources are there. Environmental data from air quality data. Visitation data to state parks, national parks, that's something that we use in our model. And then school enrollment data. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, since I know Bert's going to talk a little bit more about specific data sets and things that you may not know about. I thought I'd spend a little bit more time talking about how we're using the data and what we've learned, some of the challenges we've had, and lessons learned that we've had. So focused on the challenges, when you're thinking about how to use data for your community, really at the start, getting agreement on what the measures are and what the data sources are to use. That was a challenge. It continues to be something that we involve stakeholders in that discussion of, these are the data sets we're anticipating using. What do you think of that? Are there other ideas? Different data formats. Like I said, the health data was a new data set that I wasn't aware of prior to this effort, but it's a little bit harder to find, a little bit harder to understand, and a lot of it's in tabular format, and we've sort of been trying to figure out how we can help the health department help us better use their data, what format that might be more accessible, and partnering with them on how we can do that. Granularity of data is another challenge. Some data sets you can get very fine-grained, neighborhood-specific information. Other data sets, it's a much larger area. It might be a census tract or even larger than that. And so thinking through what level of granularity do you absolutely need, and not maybe, even if it has a large geographic extent, is it still useful information to include in some analysis? How frequently data is updated, especially because a lot of this data is not something that we produce. How important it is that you have the most up-to-date data versus just having something that's capturing an important aspect. And then knowing what the update cycle is and how it's updated. Data sets certainly can have a bias. So one example is we use something called Strava data in our active transportation model. And Strava is an application that people can put on their computer or their smartphone, and it tracks your exercise or your movement. It's primarily used by people who are recreating, and people who have money and time to sort of track those kinds of things. And so it has sort of an inherent bias towards recreation use, and you might be missing more of the commute, people who are don't have another option. So not to say that we don't think that there's value in using that data, but when you're thinking about the data sets, you're looking at what data is available, understanding that bias, and seeing if it's still usable or at least explaining how there might be some drawbacks. Data costs and ability to share proprietary data. I think that's something that we continue to figure out, is how we can make, if we're purchasing data or something like that, how we can make that available to the largest group in the state possible, making connections with our MPO partners and others, so that if there's proprietary data, we're not all purchasing the same thing, and we're making that available as much as we can. Weighting the data in models or decision-making processes is probably, I think, the most important and the biggest challenge that hasn't, that I think a lot of people gloss over the importance of that. But when you're thinking about what data to use, be thinking about how much weight it has in your decision-making, how important it is to have really solid data. That also can sort of explain how much you want to weight that data in decision-making. Whether you're putting it into a model like we are, or just using it to make a decision without a sophisticated model, understanding how much value that has to your community, that specific data set, is really important, in making sure you have time to do that. And then data doesn't always align with perceptions, and this can point out issues with the data reliability, or it can point out issues with the people reviewing the data. We've found both in this process, where people are surprised to see something, and it may be that the data set has an inaccuracy that we need to go ferret out, but in a lot of cases it's people have a perception of what the data should tell them, and if you provide it, it may differ with what their perception is, and so you have to have a discussion around the data. You can't just put it out in front of people and expect them to buy into it. Some other lessons learned: framing the use of data around goals. One of the things that we've done is, in our documentation, is really focused in on what our objective is with some of our measures. So for example, over here on the right, we want to reward projects that are located in closer proximity to educational facilities and recreational visitor destinations. And that helped us identify, what data sources did we need to find? Were they available? What kind of weight did that have when we brought it up with all the other data sets that we're using? And then how we're using that data. So we processed that data in that case to look at the proximity, but we also sort of combined some things as well to think about what's the population around that area versus the visitation, for example. Don't be afraid to ask for data, and this goes along with the next bullet of the data landscape is constantly changing. There's new data sets that pop up every other day. And so having people to ask and talk about frequently what data is available, what data is being used for in their processes, is really valuable. Bert can tell you I probably bug him fairly frequently about just understanding what data is out there, what the restrictions are, how can we get access to it, how can we partner to develop different data sets. And then combining data sets can be really powerful, not just in visualizing different data sets together, but the example of the level of traffic stress map that I have on the right here, this is where we said, okay, there's some research, academic research on comfort levels based on volume and speed limit and level of separation of active transportation facilities. We have a lot of those data sets, one-on-one, but if we could combine that and create a new data set that people could utilize, that'd be really valuable. And then the last one is making data publicly available as much as possible. And we're certainly trying to do that. With all the data that we're using in these models, we're going to try and be putting more of that up on our UPlan platform to serve that information out. But certainly, if your community is using data or developing data, making that publicly available really is helpful. So here's where to find some of this data. I think Bert has a much prettier version of some of this. But again, UPlan, which is UDOT's platform for serving out geographic data, there's an open data source component to that. WFRC has great data resources. UTA has great resources, data that's available. There's census data, something called On the Map, which is really valuable in terms of understanding commute patterns and even just socioeconomic data. And then DEQ serves out quite a bit. And these are just some examples of the ones that we're pulling out. And then you can find out more information about the UDOT prioritization process model and data. We have a whole long 40+ page document on what data we're using, how it's being processed if we're processing it, that kind of information. That's all I have in my presentation. I'd much rather spend some time answering any questions, and I'm going to try and see if I can open up the chat and see what's already come in. I don't see any. Yes, I will look. I will add that to the chat bar right now.
I don't see any questions. Bert, would you like to go ahead and proceed?
All right. Can you hear me and see the slides?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So that was a good intro, Richard. I totally admire the progress that UDOT has made in their prioritization process in but a short time, and Richard has led out on that and done an outstanding job. It's been really fun to watch and kind of be a part of a little bit here and there through coordination between our organizations. So my name is Bert Granberg. I'm in the analytics group at WFRC, and I'm going to kind of present a mishmash of resources and websites that I think might be useful. But the main theme of my presentation, I think, is that data is plentiful. We are fortunate to live in a state where, in particular, GIS data is rich and abundant. It's broad, it's deep, and there are a lot of different things that we can use data for at the local and regional planning level, and as we heard from Richard, at the state level. That includes general plans, transportation and land use studies, communicating with the public. These 3 Ps at the end of my list: prioritization, which we heard about, performance measures for evaluating scenarios, and progress monitoring. I think they all kind of get run together sometimes, but they're all distinctive applications of data. And following up on some points Richard made, I think that it's really important for everyone who's sort of in the analytics space to have some goals and some norms in mind with regard to data. And we tried at WFRC, we're trying to abide by these and implement them. But I mean, I think the data especially within the public sector, should be discoverable, it should be accessible, it should be created with the end user in mind. And I think that includes partnering with potential users who might have related capabilities that they want in a data set and trying to build those in. And then I think as a data user, I think that the norms of reusing and coordinating and having a dialogue about data sets, providing feedback if you're a data user to the person you got the resource from so they can improve things. And then also contributing what you can to the sort of ecosystem of data that we have available. I think those are all really good things for folks to strive for. And the result, when we do this, whether it's at a city level, a county level, region, state level, the result is that we're building a much more efficient process for planning. And it means that less time can be spent developing or collecting data, and more time can be spent on further delving into the important issues that matter and need solutions for. And ultimately, that all results in better decisions. So I think it's really important to get the data part right. Okay, so in the rest of my presentation, I just wanted to point out that, of course, the League is a statewide organization, and some of my examples will talk about statewide data sets. Many of them will focus in on the Wasatch Front Regional Council area, which is shown in blue in the map at the right. And then some of them will pertain to sort of the Wasatch Front urban area, which includes the Mountain Land Association of Governments MPO space as well. So apologize that this isn't necessarily geared at it in every way at a statewide level, but hopefully the examples from within our region specifically are interesting as well. Okay, so prior to the League conference, we reorganized our maps and data menu on the WFRC.org website. We wanted to get this right, simplify it, and connect people again with sort of the breadth and the depth of what we've got available. And a lot of that is through our open data site, which is accessible from data.wfrc.org or this menu item here. And that's an Esri open data site. Whenever we put up an interactive map or publish a data set that maybe isn't linked to an interactive map, something that we find useful, if it isn't published someplace else, we try to load it into our open data site so that others can discover the data set, explore it, use it either as a download or as a web service. And one of the key features of this site that we probably need to make a little bit more apparent is a sortable table of all the data sets that we maintain on our site. So there's a link right here, and it opens up this sortable table and has data sets categorized by the program area and just sort of the general area, and links to their open data pages. And it takes a little effort to keep this table in sync with what is offered at data at the in sort of the map-based exploration of the data set pages, but we think it's worthwhile. We also have a map gallery. This is new, and whenever we're putting up an interactive map, we're going to be putting it into the map gallery. We've got a featured section, a section for our primary plans and programs, and then the big list with a thumbnail of all the other maps that are out there. So encourage everyone to take a look at that. One of our featured maps has and will probably always be the Wasatch Choice map, which presents the vision for the collective Wasatch Front region. Tries to paint a picture of what 2050 looks like in Utah's Wasatch Front urban space, and then also links to regional transportation plans, land use, some of the centering goals, and whatnot. And all the data that behind this map is available from our data.wfrc.org webpage or from other sources that we are connecting to and publishing in the map. One new feature that we rolled out yesterday was we expanded the map tabs along the top of this page to include more data. So we've got this little gear icon here, and you can click on that. And you can see a few. Right now we have 5 other maps that are available, and bring those in and kind of curate a custom display of the different themes that we have. So we're just kind of carrying forward this idea of like folks can view this data in a cartographic presentation on one site, and they can do it, in one browser window, and they can kind of jump back and forth between the maps without losing their geographic area of interest that they've zoomed into. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears a little bit more and talk about data. One of the things that we have in the past couple of years spent a lot of time trying to develop are data sets that look at the interaction between the transportation system and the land use and local land uses. And this sort of framework, this approach, we've termed access to opportunities. And we've got a number of data sets I think might be available, useful to local planning efforts. A couple that like the example on the left that show employment intensity and household intensity. And then we also have workplace accessibility measures, which are shown in the upper right. We have a page on our website, wfrc.org/ATO, which explains these and provides links to data and maps. But the workplace accessibility is sort of our replacement to how many jobs are within a 20-minute drive. We're considering a broader range of commuting distances, giving more points for things that are closer. And we're using the actual peak commute travel time to figure out what people can reach within a time budget. And I think this data set is probably the best example of the Access to Opportunities framework, this idea that we're combining mobility, how fast you can travel, with proximity, what's close and nearby, to give us this accessibility measure. And there's a whole suite of accessibility measures that some of which we've implemented and others that we're working on. One of which is this access to destinations concept, like looking at travel sheds, drive times to figure out, what are areas that have grocery stores that are close by, or healthcare or schools, and what areas that comparatively speaking have to go longer to get to these key amenities. We can do this with vehicle travel times, and thanks to the active transportation data work that's been done by a lot of people in partnership and collaboration, we're now able to do these access to destination calculations with bike and pedestrian travel times as well. So that's pretty cool. Switching topics, one of the things that our group does at WFRC in the analytics space is, of course, developing and running the regional travel demand model. And we've been looking at putting more attention to deriving useful data products out of this that can be generally used for planning. I think traditionally the travel demand model has been used for projects and scenarios, but we wanted to make this data available, especially for use at like the city level. And so we created a couple months ago what we're calling our traffic volume map. And this presents observed traffic counts and then modeled into the future years through 2050 projected traffic volumes. And it's a pretty sophisticated web application. It presents that average annual daily traffic count, but it also has an advanced function. And I've got that circled in the upper part of the screen. And that allows you to look at the traffic counts together with the socioeconomic projections. So like how many people are going to be living in different places or working in different areas of our region in the future. So this tool kind of tries to bring together two key travel demand model data sets and make them work together in the comfort of a web browser. And in addition to just giving raw numbers, it also allows you to see changes between different time epochs. I mentioned this just a second ago, but everybody in our region has been putting a lot of work towards developing an active transportation data base. And Nicole Prue and our group put together this web map, which highlights some of the data that's come together just in the past year or so. So that includes existing bike infrastructure by the class of the feature bike lanes, paths, things like that. But then also the plans at the regional level and at the city level that have been put together for additional bike infrastructure. And then also some indicators of demand for future bike facilities and the quality of the existing network, which gets at sort of concepts like the level of traffic stress that Richard was talking about. And this is a good example of a data set that is available for the Wasatch Front MAG region. And I know UDOT is looking at ways to expand it so that it has broader statewide coverage. Here's a quick look at the network quality of the bike features, just to illustrate kind of the depth of what has been built for active transportation data. Again, it's kind of all come together in last couple of years, and we published this site for a map of the month a couple of months ago, so it's brand new. This data set for the WFRC area, our future land use map. This is a layer that has looked at all of the general plans of the 50+ cities in our area and tried to bring them into a common, somewhat simplified framework. We use this for our land use model for forecasting future growth, but it's also something that is relevant to transportation project decisions. And I think, like most cities have this, but their data set probably stops at their neighbors' boundaries and probably is hard to knit together into a consistent data set with those cities that are on their boundaries. So again, this is generalized. We're referring people to cities for specific details, but we think this provides a good overview data set that can be useful to folks, especially when looking at your sort of the immediate region beyond your own boundaries. And one of the things we presented, again, this was Nicole Prue again in our group at last year's League of Cities and Towns conference, was a look at parks and open space, and taking each city and looking at its public parks and its population and size, and trying to put together some basic metrics that can be a starting point for conversations about whether there's sufficient park space now in cities, or whether goals should be set to add park space in the future, or to maybe place new parks in places that aren't currently served. This map, I'm sure this will be something that we will promote a little bit further, but in addition to showing the park boundaries, it shows 10-minute walk sheds to parks, and shows what percentage of households within a city fall within those 10-minute walk sheds. Okay, so Richard talked about the list of data that I have, and I started this project a week or two ago, and I was thinking, like, what would really be great would be to have the menu of all of the planning relevant data sets, or maybe the most relevant planning data sets for local planning. And I had to throw the draft label on this because it is a work in progress. I'd like to round this out and to have a completed document to be able to share, but it's a pretty daunting process. And I think, if anything, it kind of taught me that how difficult it is for one person to put together the universe of possibilities with regard to data that's useful for planning in our area. So I think this needs some more eyes, but as you can see, I kind of put together a list by general category: our access to opportunities data, for land use, which includes the centers and district categorizations, the future land use layer that I just showed a second ago, our TLC funded projects, the parcel data, growth projections, open space data resources. Did a similar thing for transportation, resources that describe what's going on the roadways, and sort of what our travel patterns and commute patterns look like. Certainly future projects, both in the short range and the future are important to local planning. The ability to do path calculations and travel sheds, there are data sets to do that. Transit ridership, and then that whole impressive set of active transportation data that's been put together. We've got one more slide here, and that's economic development relevant data sets, things like opportunity zones and reinvestment areas, TODs, and then just general things that are always useful, like the latest aerial photography that's available, and base maps, and boundaries, and the health indicators that Richard mentioned, and then all the different data portal sites that are out there. And I think that while this list isn't complete, it illustrates how difficult it is to have sort of an overarching set of what's relevant to planning. And I think we maybe need to do a little bit more work to bring this together, and share it not only within the public sector, but with our consultants. We want to pay them for their expertise, and we probably don't want to pay them to put together a fishing expedition for data. If we can already have it packaged up and ready for them to go, they can do more meaningful work with the time that we have them on contract. So I think that this is a good goal to bring this together, but it still needs a little bit of work. And in conclusion, I just want to put one more plug for thinking about data resources and being a data steward and a data user, and thinking about it in terms of goals and norms. And I think it's especially important to have a partnering, take a partnering approach, and also to do your best job to promote what you have and what you think is available to help others. And lastly, just on the topic of dialoguing and coordinating, I encourage everyone to just never hesitate to drop someone a line via email or pick up the phone, and ask questions, ask what's available, or what could be used as a starting point before you dive in and either create something new yourself or pay someone else to do it, or settle for a data set that maybe doesn't fit your needs perfectly, when there might be something else out there that would work better. So whether it's giving us a call at WFRC, or talking to UDOT or your neighboring city, I think making this work as well as it can starts with picking up the phone or otherwise getting in contact with people to discuss data. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bert, for this wonderful presentation and all the information you provided. We do have a question in the chat box, and I believe it's for Mr. Richard Brockmeyer, from Wendy Grosvenor. It says, great use of data to prioritize projects and investments. How will you modify your model for current trends due to COVID?
It's a really great question, and one that keeps me up a little bit at night, because I don't have a great answer for it, although I think we're going to have to take a look at what the data is showing us. It might actually help show what the priorities are, even in a very constrained, when the number of trips has been reduced a little bit, although that's actually come back quite a bit. And we're actually probably in most locations almost approaching pre-COVID levels on volumes and things like that. But I think it might actually work to our benefit to see some of the trends on how certain roadways and, are we still seeing congestion issues even under a somewhat very constrained trip making pattern. So I think it might help a little bit, but we also may need to balance that with, and it goes back to how frequently we update the data sources. Does it make sense to use the latest and greatest data if it doesn't reflect what we anticipate the future post-COVID world would look like? So I think we're going to have to do a little bit of investigating of that. And yeah, I think you also mentioned, maybe changing weighting. That's also a possibility. If we feel that there's a data set that isn't really capturing something as much as or as well as we'd like to, that's a reason that we might weight that data set a little bit less of importance if we have less belief in it.
Thank you, Richard. And with that, we'll move on over to Mr. Evan Curtis.
All right, well, thank you, Rosie, and thank you to Bert and Richard. Wow, I'm really quite stunned, and I hope, I assume most of you are. It's amazing to see how things have changed with the quality and quantity data that we have available to us in our state to make better decisions. So really appreciate them sharing that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Rosie, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see it?
Yes, great. We can see it.
Perfect. So as we're going through this though, and I didn't see what the results of the poll were, but I assume that a lot of you on this in this session are probably staff working at a community level. You're looking for different data sets on how to inform your local elected officials, how to inform your planning commission, and how to make good decisions. And part of the process as we've been going through this Wasatch Choice for 2050 process is how can we find some of these data sets that are key critical data sets to measure our progress as communities, to understand how our quality of life is being impacted by our decisions. And one of the ideas was, as one of our data products, would be putting together progress measures. And this is an ongoing conversation. As I mentioned, it's part of the Wasatch Choice for 2050 collaborative. We've been working through our analysis subgroup to get their initial feedback. We've taken it to some local elected officials, but now we're seeking your feedback. And we want to hear what you have to say and hear what you think about what some of the key metrics ought to be. And so please chime in. Like I say, this is a very nascent idea. And so it's kind of at the feedback stage. We don't have data sources for all these, but really the goal is, as I said, to help policymakers understand how their decisions impact the quality of life of their community over the long term based on some key metrics. But what we wanted to do is keep it something simple, meaningful, and unwieldy. Recognizing that there are a lot of really great data sources out there that can be very useful and very needed for our planning processes. We didn't want this to get so overwhelming that you go to this report card and there's 79 measures and you scroll down and see how you're doing on each of these measures, because we want it to be useful and something that can be quickly used over time to make sure that we're making progress or not in our community. We also want to make sure it's at the right scale for a community's sphere of influence. World peace is a wonderful metric. We want world peace, not necessarily something that we can influence at the community level. So that's kind of what we're going for. What kind of measures will impact the community scale that we have impact on as community leaders, as planners, as economic development directors, and so forth. And we also wanted something that's broadly applicable to most communities in our state. We recognize that there's a broad variety of communities in our state, from very small, very rural, very remote towns to very urban, very dense, very quickly growing communities. And so that's got to be part of the balance as well to make it meaningful on a statewide basis. So what we came up with were basically 5 measures, and really they're going to be composite measures, meaning there's not one single data point that is going to inform these. And so access to opportunity, appreciated Bert sharing that. To me, I think this is such an incredible concept, such an incredible paradigm and a way of thinking of how we're doing. It's not just that we have jobs, it's not just that we have transportation, it's not just that we have housing, but where are they in relationship to each other and can they be accessed? Second, cost of living. Are we making communities that are livable for all of our residents so that our kids have opportunities to stay and live nearby? Health. Are we designing in such a way at our community that is promoting physically and mentally healthy lifestyles? Number 4, do we have accessible open space and recreation? And then 5, are our communities resilient? And this was kind of one that was added later on because it was one that was important to some elected officials. And I think, and I'm glad that they highlighted this as a measure. So I'm just going to go through each of these measures, talk through them. But like I say, what we really want to do is get your ideas, get your feedback. Let us know, are we on the right track? Would these be useful for your community? Or are there other things we should be looking at? Are there things that are maybe going beyond the mark? So let us know, either write it in the chat, or I think because it's a roundtable session, you're also welcome to chime in after this is over as well. So the first one is access to opportunity. And because Bert did such a great job explaining this one, it makes my job much easier. You know what it is. It's the number of jobs within a given car, transit, or active transportation trip of housing in the population, essentially. But also, we've talked about expanding that, and Bert also kind of hit on this with access to different destinations. Are there other amenities and services that are within a given commuter shed by these different modes of transportation? Also, looking at access to education. Do we have upward economic mobility because of these opportunities? And lastly, internet access. In today's world, access to jobs may not look like it did in the past. The COVID impact has definitely changed how we're viewing what the workplace is. But if you don't have access to internet and good broadband, it doesn't really matter if you can telework, because you just don't have that opportunity without good internet access. Second, cost of living. And the items we've discussed for this metric would be housing plus transportation costs. And again, just having housing, it can be a very expensive house, but if you live right on a transit line and you don't need to worry about transportation, then your household budget is going to be in a much better situation than if it's a very expensive house and it's also very far from where you work, and there's no public transit or other ways to get there. You've got to also have the costs associated with a car. Other items, looking at energy costs and also energy use. Do we have the ordinances in place to make sure that we can have access to some of these other forms of energy as well? Looking at wages, also economic diversity. In Utah, we are very fortunate to have a very diverse economy. In fact, as I recall, it's the most diverse economy in the nation. We want to make sure that that's true, not just at the statewide level, but our communities becoming over-reliant on a certain sector that could be disrupted by different economic cycles. Looking at job growth by county. And then finally, tax burden. You can have a great place to live, a great community with great amenities, but if it comes at a cost that is overly burdensome to our populace, then certainly that would impact quality of life. Health, and Richard touched on some of these that they're using in the UDOT model, but physical inactivity rates. It's not just a matter of having access to some of these, to the infrastructure, but are people actually using them? Are they getting out and being active? Also food accessibility. Do we have access to good quality nutrition for our residents? And then of course, in the Wasatch Front, particularly air quality and emissions is an item that is certainly of concern, but also looking at water quality. Then a couple others, the walk score. How easy is it for pedestrians to get around and be physically active? You can live really close, as the crow flies, to amenities and your place of work. But if you're separated by a freeway, you can't cross it. It doesn't really matter if you're very close. So having a good walk score and a walkable community is important for encouraging health. The level of traffic stress, and then also the Department of Health has the Health Improvement Index that would be part of that composite measure. Outdoor recreation and open space, and this is one that has been a topic that I've heard over and over in this conference. And I'm really excited, Bert, looking at the map that Nicole has put together. I'm excited to go back and look at that after this presentation. But how are we doing? On whole, I think we're doing great, but are we measuring it correctly? Do we know how we're doing as far as having usable open space within a given geography? Should that be a per capita measure? Do we need a lot more if it's in areas with a higher population? A couple of years ago, the governor instigated his 1,000 miles of family-friendly trails initiative, and we're on track to meet that goal. And again, great job by both UDOT and WFRC for starting to really look at active transportation. How is your community doing on that? Are you continuing to add those? And it looks like in the Wasatch Front region, from what Bert showed, we're making great progress on that. But also because of our unique situation as far as our topography and our land ownership, What about trailheads and access to public lands? There are a lot of areas in our region where you may border national forests, for instance, and can your residents access these lands? And then lastly, one that came up recently is just usage statistics. As we've been looking at some of these, at the COVID impact over the past several months, we've realized that in some areas we have really good data, and in some areas not so much. And I think one of these areas that we may be needing some additional information is parks and trails usage statistics. We have these great amenities. How are they being used? Are there areas that are being used more than others? If so, why? And how do we understand what areas could be used more and where there's more capacity? So that's one thought as well. And then lastly, resiliency. And certainly this year has also taught us the importance of that. Wildfire risk, our Division of Forestry, Fire and State Lands has been doing an excellent job working with communities, and the communities throughout the state have really responded in trying to manage their wildfire risk. And also I think this year has taught us a thing or two about earthquake risks as well, and the importance of making sure we're prepared for that. Utah has one of the highest numbers of unreinforced masonry buildings in the entire nation. And you know, it's really our biggest risk of fatalities in an earthquake. So do we understand that risk, and how are we doing it at responding to it? Windstorm preparedness, unsurprisingly, came up very recently and was added to this. And some of these, not sure what the data set is, not sure what this looks like, but again, these are ideas and concepts that have been thrown out there that we could use as potential measurements. And then availability of agricultural land or food production, the ability to be able to feed ourselves in the event of not being able to import our food from other areas. And then also water usage per capita, making sure we have access to enough water for our needs. And then the last one isn't so much a measure of it in and of itself. It's almost an umbrella measure, making sure that each of these measurements has an equity component. There are a few measures like the Health Improvement Index or the Environmental Justice Screening Mapping component that you could look at. But really, as we talked about it, we realized that every one of these components needs to have an equity measure. You can have a really great trail network, but it's all on one side of your community and isn't geographically distributed well enough that all of your residents have great access to it. Yeah, you might get a good score for having, you know, good recreation amenities, but maybe not very equitably distributed, and we need to make sure that we're considering that. So those are the measures. So really the next thing to do, we want to get your feedback. We want to know, are these the right measures? What do you think? What would be useful to your community, to your local elected officials, and for the work that you're doing in planning and preparing for the future? Because I know how these things go. If you don't speak up now, if you think of something later, please feel free to reach out. You can go ahead and email me at ecurtis@utah.gov. And we'd be happy to take any feedback. But otherwise, I think we do have some time now where we can discuss it if you have any thoughts.
All right, it looks like we've come to the end of our presentations. There was a question for Bert from Emily Giordio. Can we get a list of resources on the last 2 slides? There we go.
Yeah, that's, like I said, it's a work in progress, but that link will open up that presentation, and I think this sort of menu of data sets is something that the partners, data partners in Wasatch Choice and the Unified Plan ought to look at building out and sharing a little bit more prevalently prominently in the future. You know, I have one comment. Evan, you forgot toilet paper on your list of things that we might be short on. But I think in all these presentations, you know, we're talking about either data sets or developing existing data sets or developing new data sets that will help us in these planning processes. And I think that one of the things that everyone hopefully is keeping in mind and is conversant in is that I don't think the goal is really ever that we're making data-driven decisions. We're not letting the data make the decisions. It's more that we're looking for ways for good data to inform the decision-making process. So I always try to use the word data-informed versus data-driven because I think our information is finite, it's dated often, and it's really important that you have decision makers, humans, making the final call in all of these matters.
With that being said, if we don't have any more questions, I want to thank Richard, Bert, and Evan for your wonderful presentations. And thank you for gathering all that wonderful and informative data to provide us these presentations. I also want to thank everyone who joined us today, and we look forward to seeing you throughout the remainder of this conference. Thanks, everyone.